They say you never really know yourself until you've tested your limits. That's what I was thinking when I decided to take a solo camping trip out at Lake Trinity. I had always been a city guy, preferring the chaos of traffic and streetlights to the quiet rustling of the woods. But senior year had worn me down. The stress of classes, the looming specter of adulthood, job applications, everything had piled up to the point where I needed an escape. So I decided, why not go camping? It was early spring break, and I had a whole week to myself. I thought it'd be the perfect chance to get out there, breathe some fresh air, and clear my mind before graduation. My friends thought I was crazy. Lake Trinity? By yourself? They asked, eyebrows raised. And yeah, sure, maybe it wasn't the best idea to go alone. But I was stubborn, and I'd already made up my mind. I wanted peace, solitude, and a break from everything. I packed light, tent, some canned food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a knife, and one of those portable camping stoves my uncle had given me. I remember the drive down to Texas being almost therapeutic. The weather was perfect, the sky blue, and the air still held a crisp bite of late winter. By the time I got to the edge of Lake Trinity, the sun was already dipping low, painting everything in a golden glow. It was beautiful, in that untouched, wild kind of way. Setting up camp by the lake was a surprisingly smooth affair. I found a small clearing near the water's edge, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to sway and sink with the light breeze. The lake itself was tranquil, with only a few ripples here and there, reflecting the dimming sky like a mirror. I started a fire, got my tent up, and made myself some canned chili. For a while, it felt perfect. There was this strange satisfaction in sitting there, alone, in the quiet wilderness. As night fell, though, everything changed. It's funny how different the woods feel at night. What had been peaceful during the day seemed to shift into something darker as the sun disappeared. The wind picked up a little, brushing through the branches, making them creak. Shadows stretched and moved with every flicker of the campfire, and I began to feel the weight of the solitude I'd craved so much. But it wasn't until around midnight that things got strange. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers, just about ready to turn in for the night. That's when I heard it, this crunching noise coming from the woods behind me. Just a slight sound, the unmistakable snap of a twig. I froze, my hand holding the stick halfway to the fire. I listened, straining my ears against the surrounding silence. The sound came again. Crunch, crunch, closer this time. My heart started to pound in my chest, this dull, insistent thudding. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal. Deer, raccoon, maybe even a rabbit. But there was something about it, something deliberate. Slow, steady footsteps that seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. I called out, my voice cracking a little as I said, "Hey, anyone there?" The words sounded weak, getting swallowed up by the darkness almost immediately. I was met with silence, and I chuckled nervously, shaking my head, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I threw another log onto the fire, making it crackle and flare up. The bright flames should have made me feel safer, but instead, they cast more shadows, giving the woods a flickering, almost haunted look. The wind picked up again, and I heard something else. A whispering, a rustle that wasn't quite the wind. It sounded like voices? Or maybe just one voice, soft and distant, as if someone was talking just beyond the edge of the clearing. That was when I started to feel it. The unmistakable, skin-crawling sensation of being watched. It started in the pit of my stomach and spread out until my whole body felt tense, every nerve on high alert. I turned, scanning the woods, the darkness between the trees. There was nothing there, no movement, but I couldn't shake that feeling. It was like eyes were on me, staring from the depths of the forest. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was all in my head, but I couldn't ignore the instinct that something wasn't right. I stood up, rubbing my hands together, trying to shake off the cold that had suddenly settled in my bones. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything except for the tall, swaying pines. No animals, no figures, nothing that should make me feel the way I was feeling. I decided to go into my tent and call it a night. I figured I'd feel better once I was zipped up in my sleeping bag, the tent flaps closed, with the barrier of nylon between me and the outside world. I crawled inside, zipped myself in, and turned off my flashlight, lying there in the darkness, trying to listen to my own breathing and ignore everything else. But that's when I heard it, a gunshot. It wasn't loud like in movies. It was muffled by distance, but unmistakable. My eyes flew open, my body going rigid. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter, even though it wasn't hunting season. But then it happened again, closer this time. Bang! My breath caught in my throat. I was lying there, trying to convince myself it wasn't what I thought it was, that I hadn't just heard gunfire. The footsteps returned, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. My mouth went dry, and I could barely move. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an animal. Someone was out there. I could hear their heavy breathing, the unmistakable crunch of leaves under their boots. Panic surged through me, and I realized that the tent, this flimsy piece of fabric, was no protection at all. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. I reached for my backpack, fumbling for the knife I'd packed. My fingers shook, struggling to find the handle in the dark. I could hear the steps getting closer, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode. The footsteps stopped right in front of the tent flap. There was a moment of silence so complete, I thought I could hear the air moving. And then, without warning, the tent shook violently, as if someone had grabbed it and pulled. I screamed. I didn't even recognize my own voice. It was raw, full of fear. I slashed out with the knife, the blade ripping through the fabric, and I saw a shadow move, retreating, followed by another gunshot, louder this time. I didn't think. I just moved, scrambling out of the torn tent, the cold night air hitting me like a punch to the chest. I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. My mind was blank except for one thought: run. I could still hear something behind me, heavy footsteps, someone pursuing me. There was another gunshot, and I ducked instinctively, tripping over my own feet and falling face first into the dirt. Pain shot through my knee, but I pushed myself up, adrenaline drowning out everything else. The lake. I knew if I could just make it to the lake, I might have a chance. I could hear the water, the sound of waves gently hitting the shore, and I pushed myself towards it, breaking through the tree line, my breath ragged and burning. The moon was bright, reflecting off the lake's surface, and I could see the dark shape of my canoe pulled up on the shore. I stumbled towards it, my hands shaking as I untied the rope, shoving it into the water. I jumped in, grabbing the paddle, my entire body aching. I pushed off, paddling furiously, my arms screaming with pain, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if someone was still there, standing on the shore watching me. I just kept paddling out into the middle of the lake until my arms could barely move anymore, until I was surrounded by nothing but water and darkness. Finally, I let the paddle rest across my knees, my breath coming in gasps. I turned, looking back at the shore, at the tree line now just a dark silhouette against the sky. There was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the quiet lapping of water against the canoe. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my eyes never leaving the shore, waiting for something, anything, to appear. But nothing did. Slowly, the fear began to drain out of me, leaving only exhaustion in its place. I felt the tears come then, hot and sudden, and I let them fall, the realization of how close I'd come to dying hitting me all at once. I don't know who was out there or why they were after me, but I knew one thing for sure: I was never going camping again. When the sun finally started to rise, I paddled back to the shore. I could see my campsite from a distance, the remnants of my tent, torn and crumpled, the ashes of the fire pit. It looked almost normal, as if what had happened had been just a nightmare, something my mind had conjured up in the darkness. But I knew it was real. The fear I felt, the sound of those footsteps, the gunshots, none of that was my imagination. I beached the canoe, my legs trembling as I stepped out onto solid ground. My whole body ached, my muscles felt like they were on fire, and my knee throbbed where I'd fallen the night before. But I forced myself to move, to pack up whatever I could. The tent was shredded, pieces of it hanging from branches where I had slashed at it in a panic. I stuffed it all into my backpack without bothering to fold it properly. I just wanted to leave, to get out of that place as fast as I could. The entire time I was packing, I felt exposed. The morning light brought no comfort. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call felt like a warning. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that shadowy figure again, standing between the trees. But there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of someone having been there at all. It was like the night before had been wiped clean, leaving only my fear behind. I managed to get everything packed up and headed towards the trail that led back to where I had parked my car. The woods were silent, almost unnaturally so. It felt like even the birds had stopped singing, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I forced myself to keep walking, to focus on the path ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if the trees themselves had eyes, following my every move. When I finally reached my car, I almost cried with relief. It was still there, untouched, just as I had left it. I threw my backpack into the back seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, struggling to get them into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I pulled out of there as fast as I could, the gravel crunching under my tires as I sped away from that place. As I drove, the fear slowly began to fade, replaced by a strange numbness. I couldn't wrap my head around what had happened. Who had been out there? Why were they after me? There were so many questions and no answers. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had never been so scared in my life. And that feeling of being hunted, of knowing that someone wanted to hurt me, it stayed with me long after I had left Lake Trinity behind. For weeks afterward, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, convinced that I could hear footsteps outside my window, or the soft rustle of someone moving in the shadows. I even thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I heard footsteps and gunshots while I was camping alone in the middle of nowhere? I didn't have any proof, and part of me was afraid they'd just think I was crazy, or worse, that I had imagined the whole thing. In the end, I tried to move on. I told myself that it was just a one-time thing, that I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe it had been a poacher or some kind of criminal trying to scare me off. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew that whoever was out there had been hunting me, that they had wanted to hurt me, maybe even kill me. It's been over a year since that night, and I still think about it all the time. I haven't gone camping since. Not alone, not with friends, not at all. The idea of sleeping in a tent, out in the open, vulnerable, makes my skin crawl. I used to think that nature was beautiful, that the woods were a place of peace and tranquility. But now, when I think of the woods, all I can remember is that cold fear, the sense of being watched, the feeling of running for my life through the darkness. The thing that scares me the most, though, is that I'll never know who it was or why they were there. There's no closure, no neat ending where the bad guy gets caught and I get to move on. It's just this lingering fear, this knowledge that somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, there are things that don't want to be found. People who hide in the shadows, waiting. And I was unlucky enough to stumble across one of them. Sometimes when I'm out late at night, walking to my car, I swear I can still feel it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the sense of eyes watching me from the darkness. And I turn, expecting to see someone there, just a shadow slipping out of sight. But there's never anyone there. Just the empty night, silent and still. It's a feeling I don't think I'll ever shake, that somewhere, somehow, someone is still out there watching, waiting. That trip to Lake Trinity was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to connect with nature, to find some peace. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life, something that changed the way I see the world. Now I know there are places where we aren't meant to go alone, places where something waits in the dark, patient and silent. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you might hear a twig snap or a whisper through the trees. And if you do, my advice is to run. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run. Because some things out there aren't meant to be found, and some shadows should never be followed. I still remember that trip to Snow Lake like it happened yesterday. You know, it was one of those ideas that seemed perfect at first, like a romantic notion of escaping the noise of the world, getting lost in nature, and rediscovering yourself. That's what I wanted. So I packed up my gear, filled the trunk with supplies, and drove out to Snow Lake all by myself, thinking I'd have a few days of peace away from everything. Snow Lake was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place I'd read about in travel guides as serene and beautifully untouched, especially during fall. And they weren't lying. The leaves were just beginning to change color, golden reds and orange hues, the kind of scenery that could make anyone believe in magic again. But I wasn't prepared for the way loneliness creeps in when the sun drops behind the mountains and shadows grow thicker. The first day was gorgeous. I spent it hiking around the lake, breathing in the crisp autumn air, listening to the sound of the leaves crunching under my boots, and the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the water. There wasn't a soul around, which was exactly what I wanted, until I realized how strange it felt to be totally alone. By sunset, I had found a perfect little spot for my tent, just close enough to the lake that I could hear the gentle lapping of water, but far enough that I felt protected by the trees. I remember how cold it got that night. The temperature had plummeted, much lower than I had expected, and the wind had picked up, rustling the branches above me. I cocooned myself in my sleeping bag, trying to stay warm. I had brought a small portable heater, but even then, the chill felt like it was seeping through my skin. My tent flapped in the wind, creating this rhythmic rustling that at first felt kind of soothing. I must have dozed off at some point, lost in that strange mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. But the dream I had, oh, that dream, wasn't right. I can't even fully explain it now, but there was a man. I didn't see his face, only his shadow, standing in front of my tent. He was holding something sharp, and I remember the way it glinted in the moonlight. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. That's when I woke up, gasping, my heart thudding so loud I thought it might echo in the empty woods. It took me a second to remember where I was. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just a bad dream. But then I heard something, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or to the rustling leaves. It was a faint, metallic noise. At first I thought maybe it was just the wind again, maybe knocking something against my tent poles. But it wasn't. It was deliberate, a slow, dragging kind of sound, the sound of a zipper. The realization came over me like ice water, paralyzing. It was the sound of someone or something pulling at the zipper of my tent flap. My whole body went rigid. I remember feeling every single heartbeat as if it were going to break through my chest. I had a gun with me. I had brought it just in case, some old revolver my dad had insisted I carry. I didn't even like guns, but suddenly I was grateful it was there, stashed under my backpack beside me. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, wrapping around the cold steel. The zipper moved again, slowly, carefully, almost like whoever was out there didn't want me to know they were there. My mind went blank with terror. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. This wasn't one of those camping stories that people laugh about later. I was alone, and someone was trying to get into my tent in the dead of night. I gathered myself enough to call out. My voice came out in a shaky shout. "Get away from my tent! I have a gun!" There was silence, a pause so thick it felt like time had stopped. I couldn't hear the wind anymore, or the water, just the blood rushing in my ears and the muted thud of my heartbeat. And then, slowly, the zipper started moving again. I pointed the gun at the entrance, not really knowing if I'd actually be able to pull the trigger if it came to that. It wasn't like I was some hero from a movie. I was terrified. I wanted to be anywhere but there, but I felt I had no choice. I shouted again, louder this time, trying to sound brave. I said, "Get away!" The zipper stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. A second felt like an eternity, and in that silence, I thought maybe whoever it was had decided to leave. I was wrong. There was a sudden, violent yank on the zipper, like someone was done with games. I screamed without thinking and squeezed the trigger. The noise was deafening inside the tent, and the flash briefly lit up the fabric around me. I fired again, just out of pure panic. And then there was nothing, no movement, no sound, just my ragged breathing. My ears rang from the shots, and I could hardly think straight. Had I hit them? Was there even anyone out there? Part of me feared maybe it was just my imagination, that maybe I just shot into the empty night, but I knew I heard something. I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. It took me what felt like forever to dial 911, and when the operator answered, my voice broke. I could barely get the words out to tell them where I was, but they understood enough to send help. "Stay on the line," the operator told me, and I did, clutching the phone to my ear, my gun still pointed at the half-open zipper of the tent. The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I could hear every little noise, the creak of branches, the rustle of leaves, but I couldn't hear anyone moving around outside. The tent flap stayed still. At some point, the operator said the Rangers were getting close, that I'd hear their vehicle soon. And I did. Those lights, the sound of an engine, I'd never been so relieved in my entire life. I nearly broke down when they finally arrived. 2 Rangers approached my tent cautiously, calling out my name. I unzipped the flap myself, my hands still trembling, and stepped out, feeling the cold night air hit my face. I remember seeing their faces, concerned but calm, and I just lost it. The gun slipped from my hand, landing on the ground, and I started sobbing. They asked me what happened, and I tried my best to explain, though everything was a blur. One of the Rangers went to check the surrounding area while the other stayed with me. He kept trying to reassure me, telling me I'd done the right thing by calling for help. After what felt like ages, the other Ranger returned, shaking his head. He didn't find anyone. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. Just the 2 bullet holes in the ground a few feet from my tent. They took me back to their station for the night. I couldn't stop shaking, even after they offered me a blanket and a hot drink. They said it was possible it was just an animal, maybe a curious bear. But I knew what I heard. The deliberate, slow sound of that zipper being pulled. It wasn't an animal. I knew that in my bones. The next morning, they escorted me back to my campsite to pack up my things. Everything looked almost untouched, as if nothing had happened, but I could still see the 2 holes in the ground where I had fired the gun. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay there any longer than I had to. Before I left, one of the Rangers handed me a small card with their direct number, just in case I ever needed anything. He gave me this look, like he believed me, like he knew there was something out there too. I drove away from Snow Lake and promised myself I'd never go camping alone again. And even now, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I hear the sound of a zipper being pulled, that slow, deliberate sound that still makes my skin crawl. It's funny, you know. I thought having a gun would make me feel safer, would give me some sense of control. But that night, it just made me realize how utterly unprepared I was to actually use it. I wasn't a hero. I was just someone trying to get away from it all. Someone who found out that sometimes the real danger isn't just in the wilderness, but in the quiet moments when you think you're alone, until you're not. There are some stories that stick with you forever, ones that never seem to fade, no matter how much time passes. This is one of those stories. And honestly, it's not even my story to tell. It's my best friend Lucas's story. Or maybe more accurately, it's his dad's. But I was there for so much of it, watching from the outside, feeling helpless, scared, and confused. And I still can't quite shake the feeling that something went terribly wrong, something that no one could ever really explain. It all started when Mr. Harper, Lucas's dad, decided to go camping up in the Northwest Territories of Canada. You have to understand, this was not something anyone in the Harper family expected. Mr. Harper wasn't exactly what you'd call the outdoorsy type. He was more of a handyman, always tinkering in the garage, fixing things around the house, or catching a game on TV. So when he suddenly announced that he was going to take a solo camping trip, everyone was pretty surprised. It wasn't like him, and Lucas told me how it was out of the blue. He said his dad had looked at a map one day, pointed at the vast expanse of the Northwest Territories, and decided that was where he needed to be. No explanation, no reason. He just said it was something he had to do. He packed his gear, bought a canoe, loaded up supplies for the trip, and told his family he'd be back in a week or so. I could tell Lucas was uneasy about it, but his dad seemed determined, and there was something in the way he spoke about the trip, like it was more of a calling than a vacation, that made everyone back off a little. The first few days, Lucas got a couple of texts from his dad. Just small things. Set up camp near the lake, caught some fish for dinner, things like that. Nothing unusual, and everything seemed fine. But after the third day, the text stopped. No more updates, no more pictures, just radio silence. At first, Lucas wasn't too worried. He figured his dad was out of range, or maybe just enjoying the solitude without the interruptions of modern life. But as the days stretched on, the unease started to creep in. Lucas's mom, Mrs. Harper, tried to keep herself calm, telling herself that Mr. Harper would be back soon, that he was probably just off-grid. But I could see the worry in her eyes, and Lucas, well, he wasn't sleeping much. I know because he would text me late at night asking if I thought something was wrong. He'd say things like, "Do you think he's okay?" Or "What if something happened?" Then, day 7 passed. Then 8. By day 10, Mrs. Harper finally made the call. She called the authorities, reported Mr. Harper as missing, and within hours a search was underway. I remember the day Lucas called me to tell me they were going up north to help with the search. His voice cracked, and I could hear the fear in it. They found his camp, he said, but not him. He was going up with his mom and his uncle to try to help, and he asked if I'd come along just to be there. Of course I agreed. I couldn't let him go through this alone. The flight up to the Northwest Territories felt surreal. The landscape stretched endlessly below us, forests, lakes, rivers, all untouched by civilization. It was beautiful, but it was also terrifying. There was so much emptiness, so many places for someone to disappear. I could see Lucas staring out the window, his jaw clenched, eyes distant. We didn't talk much during that flight. We arrived at a small outpost where the local rangers had set up their search base. It was a modest building, surrounded by dense woods, the air crisp and biting cold despite it being spring. The wind carried a sharp chill, and it rustled through the pine trees with a whispering sound, like it was trying to tell us something. The rangers were kind, but their faces were solemn. They'd been looking for Mr. Harper for a few days now, and while they'd found his camp, there hadn't been a single trace of him. When we reached the camp, it was like stepping into a ghost story. The tent was still set up, though the flaps were swaying slightly in the wind. The campfire was long cold, the blackened remains of wood scattered in the pit. His belongings were all there, neatly arranged, almost untouched. His canoe had been dragged up onto the bank, and his gear, fishing rods, dog supplies, even though he didn't bring the family dog with him, cooking utensils, was all accounted for. Everything was in its place. Everything except Mr. Harper. It was eerie. There was no sign of a struggle, no signs of wild animals. It was as if he had simply stood up and walked away, leaving everything behind. I could see the confusion and fear etched on Lucas's face. He kept looking around, calling out for his dad, his voice growing more desperate each time, but there was no answer. Only the sound of the wind through the trees and the distant lapping of the lake against the shore. We spent hours that day helping the rangers comb through the woods, calling his name, searching for any clue as to where he might have gone. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick and unforgiving. Branches caught at our clothes, and the ground was uneven, covered in roots and rocks that made every step a struggle. The air was cold, and the further we went into the woods, the more the silence seemed to press in on us. It was like the forest was swallowing us whole. I remember at one point we came across a small clearing, and Lucas just stopped. He stood there staring at the ground, his shoulders slumping. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what to say. I just put a hand on his shoulder, trying to be there for him. There was nothing to find, no trail, no footprints, no broken branches. It was like Mr. Harper had vanished into thin air. The rangers eventually called us back to the camp as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky turned a deep orange, and the shadows grew long, creeping across the ground like dark fingers. The temperature dropped quickly, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. We gathered around a small fire the rangers had built, the flames casting flickering light on our faces. Mrs. Harper sat silently, her eyes fixed on the fire, her face pale and drawn. Lucas sat beside her, staring out into the darkness, his expression hollow. That night, we camped there, hoping maybe, just maybe, Mr. Harper would come back. I barely slept. Every little noise made me sit up, my heart pounding. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an animal. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching us. I wasn't alone in feeling that way. Lucas stayed awake too, his eyes scanning the dark woods, his hand gripping a flashlight like it was a lifeline. The next morning, one of the rangers approached us. He had a strange expression on his face, a mix of confusion and something else, something I couldn't quite place. He told us that they had found the canoe. It was downstream, caught in some brush along the riverbank, several miles away from the campsite. It was empty, no sign of Mr. Harper. But the strange thing was, it looked like it had been placed there intentionally. There were no scratches, no signs of it being carried by the current. It was just there, as if someone had put it there and walked away. I could see the hope drain from Lucas's face at that moment. He looked at his mom, and I saw the tears welling up in his eyes. I wanted to say something, anything, to make it better, but there were no words. We all knew what it meant. The canoe was the only way Mr. Harper could have traveled any real distance. Without it, he was either lost in the vast wilderness or... We spent 2 more days searching, but there was nothing. No sign of him, no clue as to what had happened. It was like the forest had swallowed him whole and refused to give him back. Eventually, the rangers had to call off the search. It was too dangerous to keep looking, they said. The weather was turning, and the terrain was too rough. They were sorry, they told us, but there was nothing more they could do. The ride back to town was quiet. Lucas stared out the window, his face pale, his eyes distant. Mrs. Harper held his hand, her own eyes red from crying. I sat beside them, feeling helpless, the weight of everything pressing down on me. It didn't feel real, none of it did. How could someone just disappear like that, without a trace? When we got back home, things weren't the same. The Harper house, which had always been so full of life, felt empty. Lucas stopped talking as much, and when he did, his voice was flat, emotionless. He stopped coming to class for a while, and when I did see him, he looked like a ghost of himself, hollow-eyed, withdrawn. I tried to be there for him, but of course I knew there was only so much I could do. How do you comfort someone who has lost their dad in such a strange, inexplicable way? It wasn't like he could mourn properly. There wasn't even a body to say goodbye to, just a void where his father used to be. And without closure, the questions never stopped eating away at him. A few weeks after we got back, I remember Lucas called me over to his house. It was late, way past the time he'd usually reach out, and I could tell from his voice that something was wrong. When I got there, he was sitting in the garage, staring at a bunch of his dad's old camping gear. The lanterns, the ropes, the portable stove, it was all laid out in front of him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, almost frantic. "Something doesn't make sense," he said. He handed me his dad's journal, the one he'd taken with him on the trip. The rangers had found it in the tent, untouched. Lucas hadn't been able to bring himself to read it before, but now it seemed like he'd read every word 1,000 times. The entries started off normal, his dad writing about the lake, the beauty of the wilderness, the sound of the wind in the trees. But then, a few entries in, things started to change. The writing became erratic, disjointed. He wrote about hearing noises at night, footsteps around his tent, shadows moving through the trees. He described waking up in the middle of the night, certain that someone was standing just beyond the light of his fire, watching him. March 17th. Lucas read out loud, his voice shaking. He wrote, "I swear I heard them again last night. Voices. Just whispers, but close, right outside the tent. I'm not alone here. I know it. Something is watching me. I can't shake this feeling." Lucas looked at me, his eyes full of fear. He knew something was out there, man. He felt it. He pointed to another entry, dated just a day before the last message Lucas received from him. It's like he knew something was coming. We both sat there in silence, the weight of those words pressing down on us. I could almost feel the cold air from that campsite again, the way the wind had whispered through the trees, the way the woods had seemed to close in around us. I didn't know what to say to Lucas. How could I tell him that his dad was just imagining things when deep down, I wasn't even sure myself? After that night, Lucas changed even more. It was like he was obsessed. He spent hours on his computer, researching the area, trying to find any mention of similar disappearances or strange happenings in the Northwest Territories. He'd call me in the middle of the night, talking about legends of people who vanished in the woods, stories about spirits or mysterious figures that lived deep in the wilderness. He became fixated on trying to understand what happened to his dad. One evening, he showed me an old article he'd found from decades ago. It was about a group of trappers who had gone missing in the same area. The article described how their camp had been found abandoned, their gear left behind, just like Mr. Harper's. There was no sign of them, no evidence of an animal attack or foul play, just emptiness. "It's like they vanished," Lucas whispered, his eyes glued to the screen. "Just like my dad." I tried to reason with him, to tell him that there had to be a logical explanation, that maybe his dad had gotten lost, or maybe the currents had taken him farther than anyone expected. But Lucas wouldn't hear it. He was convinced that something else had happened, that there was something in those woods, something people didn't understand. He told me he could feel it too, that cold, creeping sense of being watched, that feeling that something was out there. Eventually, Lucas decided he needed to go back. He said he couldn't move on until he did. He needed answers, closure, something to help him understand. I tried to talk him out of it. So did Mrs. Harper. She was terrified, begging him not to go, but there was a determination in his eyes, a need that no one could reason with. He asked me to go with him, and honestly, I didn't want to. Every instinct in me was screaming to stay away from that place, to let it go. But Lucas was my best friend, and I knew I couldn't let him go through it alone. So a year after Mr. Harper's disappearance, we found ourselves back at the Northwest Territories, standing on the edge of that same lake, the air cold and biting, the sky overcast and gray. The camp looked exactly as I remembered it, like it had been frozen in time. The Rangers had left everything as it was, at Mrs. Harper's request, hoping that maybe one day they'd find something that could explain what had happened. The tent was still there, collapsed and torn, the fire pit covered in ash, the empty cans scattered near the logs. Lucas stood there for a long time, staring at the scene, his jaw clenched. He didn't say anything, but I could see the pain in his eyes. We spent the first day going over the area, trying to see if there was anything we missed the first time, anything that could tell us where Mr. Harper had gone. But it was just like before. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. The silence of the forest was oppressive, the air heavy with something I couldn't quite put into words. That night, we set up our tent near the old camp, the fire crackling between us. Lucas had his dad's journal, and he kept reading the entries, over and over. As the night wore on, the wind picked up and the temperature dropped. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows around us, and that old feeling returned, that sense of being watched, of something moving just beyond the circle of light. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't leave. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but the moment my eyes opened, I felt it. That cold dread, that awareness that something was wrong. I turned my head and saw Lucas, sitting upright, his eyes wide, staring out into the darkness. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first there was nothing, just the rustling of the wind through the trees, the soft lapping of the water against the shore. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the breeze. It was soft, almost too quiet to hear, but it was there. Voices. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, like someone speaking just beyond the edge of the firelight, their voice low and urgent. Lucas looked at me, his face pale. "It's the same," he said, his voice barely audible, just like in the journal. The whispers grew louder, coming from all directions, circling us, moving through the trees. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling as I reached for the flashlight. I turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just empty woods, the trees swaying in the wind. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to be getting closer, pressing in on us. Lucas stood up, his flashlight in hand, and started walking towards the trees. "Lucas, wait," I hissed, grabbing his arm, but he shook me off. "I need to know," he said, his voice shaking. "I need to know what happened to him." He moved towards the tree line, the beam of his flashlight bobbing with each step. I followed, my heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to turn back to run, but I couldn't leave him. We moved deeper into the woods, the whispers growing louder, the darkness closing in around us. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out, the air growing colder with each step. Suddenly, Lucas stopped. He shone his flashlight ahead, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Do you see that?" he whispered. I squinted, my eyes struggling to adjust. And then I saw it, a shape just beyond the reach of the light. It was faint, almost like a shadow, but it was moving. It was a person, standing there, watching us. My stomach twisted with fear, my legs going weak. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, watching. And then, without a sound, it turned and slipped into the darkness, disappearing between the trees. Lucas took off after it, his flashlight bobbing wildly. "Lucas, no!" I shouted, but he was already gone, the darkness swallowing him up. I ran after him, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks, the cold air cutting at my face. The whispers were all around me now, louder, more urgent, like they were trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. I ran, calling Lucas's name, but there was no answer. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees all looking the same, the ground uneven and treacherous. I stumbled, falling to my knees, the flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling away, its beam flickering before going out. The whispers seemed to close in, surrounding me, and I felt that cold dread again. That sense of something watching me, something that wasn't meant to be seen. I don't know how long I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The whispers were relentless, like they were wrapping around me, tightening, each one blending into the next until it was almost a scream. I forced myself up, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the flashlight. My fingers finally found it, cold and covered in dirt. I clicked it back on, the beam weak but enough to pierce through the immediate darkness. I called out again, "Lucas." My voice echoed off the trees, swallowed by the surrounding void. The fear that had been an underlying current now overwhelmed me, a tide of panic threatening to drag me under. My mind raced with images of Lucas alone in the dark, chasing shadows, and I felt my chest tighten. I couldn't leave him out here, not alone, but it felt like the forest was alive, shifting, changing, like it was trying to keep me away from him, keep me from finding my way. I forced myself to move, stumbling forward, each step a struggle against the fear that was clawing at my mind. The beam of my flashlight swung across the trees, and for a moment I thought I saw something, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the light. My stomach dropped, and I turned the flashlight quickly, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. Just the swaying of the branches in the cold wind. I shook my head, trying to clear the panic. I had to find Lucas. I pushed forward, my eyes straining in the dim light. The ground was uneven, and I tripped over a root, almost falling. I caught myself, breathing heavily. And then I heard it, a voice, distant but clear. Lucas's voice, calling my name. I whipped my head around, the beam of the flashlight darting across the trees. "Lucas?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Where are you?" The voice came again, closer this time, from somewhere to my left. I turned and started moving that way, my feet slipping on the cold, damp ground. The trees seemed to crowd in closer, their branches like skeletal fingers, reaching, grasping. The whispers had faded now, replaced by the sound of my own breathing, the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. And then I saw him. Lucas standing there, his back to me, just at the edge of the clearing. Relief flooded through me, and I rushed towards him, my legs almost giving out from the sheer exhaustion and panic that had built up. "Lucas," I called out, my voice almost a sob, but he didn't turn. He just stood there, staring into the dark woods ahead. I stopped, a few feet away, my breath catching in my throat. Something felt wrong, his posture, it was stiff, unnatural, like he was frozen in place. "Lucas," I said again, softer this time, stepping closer. The flashlight beam flickered, and I felt my stomach twist with dread. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched his shoulder. His body was cold, unnaturally so, and he still didn't move. Slowly, he turned his head to look at me, and I gasped, stumbling back. His eyes, they were wide, empty, like he was looking through me, not at me. His face was pale, almost gray, his lips slightly parted. "Lucas?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he raised one hand, pointing towards the darkness ahead. I turned, following his gaze, and that's when I saw it. a shadow standing between the trees. It was tall, thin, almost blending into the darkness around it. But its eyes, they were there, two pinpricks of light, staring at us, unblinking. My entire body went cold, and I felt the flashlight slip from my fingers, clattering to the ground. The light flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging us into darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing all around us, and I felt a hand, Lucas's hand, grab my arm, his fingers like ice, pulling me, dragging me towards the shadow. "No!" I screamed, struggling, my voice lost in the cacophony of whispers. I fought against his grip, but it was like he wasn't even aware of me, like he was in some kind of trance. I could feel the pull of the shadow ahead, the cold, dark presence that seemed to reach out, wrapping around us. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. There was only fear, only the sense that if I went any closer, if I stepped into that darkness, I would never come back. With a surge of desperation, I wrenched my arm free, stumbling back, falling to the ground. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, and I saw Lucas take another step forward, his eyes still empty, still fixed on that shadow. "Lucas, please!" I shouted, my voice raw, my throat burning. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. The forest fell silent, the air heavy and still. Lucas froze, his body swaying slightly, and then he collapsed, crumpling to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. I scrambled towards him, my hands shaking as I turned him over, his face pale, his eyes closed. "Lucas?" I whispered, my voice breaking. He didn't respond. His breathing was shallow, his skin cold to the touch. I shook him, trying to wake him, tears blurring my vision. "Please, Lucas, please." Somehow, I managed to get him to his feet, my arm around his shoulders, half dragging him through the woods. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from there, away from whatever had been in that clearing. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides, but I kept moving, driven by pure fear, by the need to save my best friend. I don't remember how long it took, but eventually I saw it, the flicker of our campfire through the trees. I stumbled towards it, pulling Lucas with me, my legs barely holding me up. We reached the clearing and I collapsed beside the fire, pulling Lucas down with me. His eyes were still closed, his breathing slow, but he was alive. He was alive. I sat there, holding him, staring into the flames, my mind numb, the events of the night playing over and over in my head. The whispers, the shadow, the way Lucas had looked at me, like he wasn't even there. I didn't understand it. I still don't. All I knew was that we needed to get out of those woods, to get away from whatever had been out there. When morning finally came, I managed to get Lucas into the canoe, his body limp, his eyes still closed. I paddled us back to the nearest outpost, my arms aching, my mind blank. The rangers took one look at us and called for help, their faces pale, their eyes full of questions. But I had no answers. How could I explain what had happened? How could I make sense of something that made no sense at all? Lucas eventually woke up, but he didn't remember anything. Not the whispers, not the shadow, not even going into the woods. It was like the entire night had been wiped from his memory. He looked at me, confused, scared, and I didn't know what to tell him. How could I explain what I didn't understand myself? We never talked about it after that. Not really. Lucas knew something had happened, but he didn't want to know the details. And honestly, I didn't want to remember them. We left the Northwest Territories behind, and we never went back. The Harper family moved away not long after, and Lucas and I drifted apart. I think part of him blamed himself for what happened, and part of me blamed myself too, for not stopping him, for not being able to protect him. It's been years now, but I still think about that night. I still hear those whispers sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, and the darkness seems to stretch on forever. I still see that shadow, those eyes, watching, waiting, and I still feel that cold, creeping fear. That sense that there are things out there, in the places we're not meant to go, things that watch us, things that wait for the right moment to reach out and pull us in. I don't know what happened to Mr. Harper. I don't know if he got lost, if he drowned, or if something else took him. But I do know one thing, whatever it was, it's still out there somewhere in those woods. You know, I've never really enjoyed camping all that much. I'm more of a rent-a-cozy cabin type of person. Hot chocolate by the fire, a warm bed, and no bugs. But there was something about that trip. Maybe it was the timing, or maybe it was just that everyone else was so excited about it that I didn't want to be the one to bring down the vibe. It was the first time I'd gone camping with Tyler, my ex-boyfriend, after we'd broken up, and I guess I just wanted to show that I could be cool with it, that I wasn't bothered by the fact that he was there or that things were a little weird. Anyway, it was me, Tyler, and 3 of our mutual friends, Anna, Jeff, and Sarah. We all used to hang out a lot, especially back when Tyler and I were still together. We thought a camping trip would be a fun way to relive some of the good times, you know? The location we chose was this forested park a few hours' drive away. It was the kind of place where you can still get a phone signal, but feel like you're miles away from civilization. The woods were dense, with tall pines that made you feel like you were a tiny piece of something much bigger. The ground was covered in a thick blanket of leaves and pine needles, and at night, the whole place had this kind of magic to it, like stepping back in time. We set up our tents in a clearing not too far from a small lake. The air was crisp, with that earthy scent that only comes from being deep in the woods. The first evening went pretty well. We had a fire going, roasted marshmallows, and traded stories until the fire started to die down and we all decided it was time to sleep. It felt nice, almost like old times, even if there was that awkward tension with Tyler, a tension neither of us wanted to acknowledge. It must have been around midnight when the temperature started dropping fast. I woke up in the middle of the night, shivering, even though I was wrapped up tightly in my sleeping bag. I remember listening to the wind rustling through the trees and hearing the occasional creak of branches as they swayed. It wasn't loud, but it felt almost like whispers, like the woods were trying to communicate something. I could hear Tyler shifting in his tent next to mine. His tent was so close that if we reached out, we probably could have touched hands. I tried to fall back asleep, but something kept me on edge. There was a stillness in the air, a kind of heavy silence that felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was nearby, watching us. But eventually, exhaustion won over my anxiety, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning it was Jeff who found the damage. His shout woke all of us up, and we rushed over to see what was going on. His car, where we'd stashed most of our gear, including extra clothes, food, and even our phones, had been broken into. The driver's side window was shattered, and everything inside had been torn apart. The doors were open, and some of our bags were missing. Jeff looked pale, his eyes wide, his hands shaking slightly as he kept running them through his hair. "Who the hell would do this?" he kept saying, over and over, almost like a mantra. The rest of us stood there, stunned. It wasn't just Jeff's car either. Tyler's old SUV, parked next to it, had its tires slashed, and all our camping supplies had been pulled out and scattered around. The weirdest part, though, was that none of us had heard a thing. No footsteps, no glass breaking, no one rifling through the cars, nothing. I remember Tyler turning to me, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and worry. "Did you lock the car?" he asked, his voice a little sharper than it needed to be. I felt my stomach tighten. I knew where this was going. We'd had this argument 1,000 times when we were dating. Tyler was always meticulous about locking doors, car doors, apartment doors, everything. And me, well, let's just say I wasn't quite as careful. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, waiting for my response. "I thought I did," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But truth be told, I couldn't really remember. It had been late, we were tired from the drive, and maybe I hadn't double-checked. Tyler just shook his head, his jaw clenched, and I could feel the rift between us widening, all that old tension boiling up again. The rest of the morning was a mess. We tried to salvage what we could, but a lot of our supplies were gone. Jeff and Sarah wanted to leave right away, but Tyler insisted we stay, at least until we could figure out what exactly had happened. Anna was caught in the middle, trying to keep everyone calm, suggesting we could hike to a nearby ranger station to report the break-in. It was only a few miles away, she said, and we could regroup after that. Tyler and I stayed behind while the others went to find the ranger station. He wanted to see if he could fix the tire enough to at least get us moving. It was awkward, just the two of us. We worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustle of the wind and the occasional clink of metal as Tyler worked on the tire. After what felt like an eternity, Tyler finally spoke, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I had a weird dream last night," he said, not looking at me. He kept his eyes on the tire, his hands busy, but I could tell something was bothering him. "I dreamt, I don't know, it felt real, like someone was outside the tent. I could hear them trying to open the car doors. I could see their shadow moving around." He paused, finally glancing up at me. I thought it was just a dream, but now, I don't know. A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. The way he said it, the way his eyes looked almost haunted, made something twist inside me. I tried to laugh it off, to make it seem less serious. "It was probably just the wind, Tyler. You know how your mind can play tricks on you out here." But Tyler shook his head, his expression darkening. "It wasn't the wind. I'm telling you, someone was out there." We both fell silent after that, the tension between us growing heavier, more oppressive. The wind picked up, and I could hear it moving through the trees, that same whispering sound I'd heard the night before. Only now, it felt different, like it was taunting us, reminding us of how alone we were out here. When the others came back, they didn't have much good news. The ranger station was closed, and they hadn't seen anyone else out on the trails. It was like we were the only ones out there, completely cut off. We decided we'd leave as soon as we could get the cars in working condition. Jeff's car was a lost cause with the broken window and the mess inside, but Tyler managed to patch the tire enough that we could limp our way back to civilization. That night, we all stayed close to the fire. No one wanted to go back into their tents, and honestly, none of us wanted to sleep. There was this unspoken fear that if we closed our eyes, we'd wake up to something worse. The fire crackled, and I remember watching the shadows dance across the ground, the light flickering on everyone's faces. We tried to make small talk, to keep the mood light, but it was forced. The fear was palpable, hanging over us like a storm cloud. At some point, the conversation died down, and we all sat there in silence. That's when we heard it, a faint rustling coming from the edge of the clearing. My head snapped up, my heart pounding in my chest. Tyler and Jeff exchanged a glance, and then Jeff stood, grabbing a flashlight. "Probably just an animal," he said, though his voice lacked confidence. He shone the light towards the noise, and for a second I saw something, just a glimpse, a flash of movement between the trees. It was fast, too fast to make out any details, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Jeff didn't answer. He just kept the flashlight trained on the spot, his face tense. The light flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something again, something tall, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. And then it was gone. Tyler stood up, his eyes wide, his jaw tight. "We need to go, now." No one argued. We scrambled to pack up what little we had left, our movements frantic, the fear driving us. The wind picked up again, that same low whisper echoing through the trees, and I swear I could hear something else, something beneath the wind. A voice faint and distant, almost like it was calling out to us. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on packing, but the fear was overwhelming, pressing down on me until it was hard to breathe. I thought it wouldn't start at all. My heart pounded in my ears, and I felt like time had slowed to a crawl, the seconds stretching out unbearably as Tyler turned the key again and again. I could see Jeff in the rearview mirror, his face pale, his eyes darting to the tree line, and Anna next to him, her lips pressed together in a tight, terrified line. Come on. Tyler muttered under his breath, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The SUV sputtered, coughed, and then, finally, the engine roared to life. Relief washed over me like a wave, and I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. "Go!" Jeff shouted, his voice cracking, and Tyler didn't need to be told twice. He slammed his foot down on the gas, the tires skidding on the loose dirt before finding traction. The SUV lurched forward, and we sped down the rough trail, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the trees rushing past in a blur. The road out of the campsite was narrow and winding, and Tyler had to slow down more than I wanted him to. Every second felt like a lifetime, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. I kept looking back, expecting to see something running after us, something emerging from the woods, but there was nothing, just the dark shapes of the trees and the shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as we moved. No one spoke. The only sounds were the roar of the engine and the crunch of the gravel beneath the tires. I could feel the tension in the car, thick and stifling, each of us lost in our own fear, our own thoughts about what had just happened. My mind kept going back to that shadow I'd seen, the figure standing at the edge of the clearing. There had been something wrong about it, something in the way it moved, the way it seemed to vanish as soon as the light hit it. The SUV bounced over a pothole, and Tyler cursed under his breath, his hands tightening on the wheel. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and I found myself glancing at the clock on the dashboard, watching the minutes tick by, feeling like we weren't getting any closer to safety. The forest outside the window was pitch black, the trees blurring together into a wall of darkness. And then, out of nowhere, the engine started to sputter. The SUV jerked, the headlights flickering, and my heart leapt into my throat. "No, no, no," Tyler muttered, his eyes wide, his foot pressing harder on the gas. But the engine was losing power, the car slowing down, and the headlights dimmed until they were barely more than a glow. "What's happening?" Anna's voice was high and shaky, and I could hear the panic in it, the same panic that was rising inside me. "I don't know," Tyler said, his voice tight. He twisted the key in the ignition, trying to restart it, but the engine just made a low grinding noise before dying completely. We rolled to a stop, the darkness closing in around us, the silence almost deafening. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. It was like we were all waiting, listening, hoping that somehow the car would start again, that we could get out of there. But there was nothing, just the wind outside and the creaking of the trees. "We have to get out of here," Jeff said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He fumbled for the door handle, his hands shaking, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that I felt. The fear that whatever was out there in those woods, whatever had been watching us, was still there, and it was waiting. "Wait," Tyler said, his voice low, but Jeff had already opened the door. The wind rushed in, cold and sharp, carrying with it that whispering sound, the same sound we'd heard back at the campsite, the same sound that seemed to be calling to us, luring us out. Jeff hesitated, his hand on the door, his eyes darting to the darkness outside. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, and we all listened. It was faint, almost impossible to hear over the rustling of the leaves, but it was there. A voice, low and insistent, just beyond the edge of the light. "Close the door," Tyler said, his voice tense, but Jeff didn't move. He was staring out into the dark, his eyes wide, his face pale. "Jeff, close the door," I said, my voice rising, but it was like he couldn't hear me. He stepped out of the car, his movements slow and stiff, almost like he was in a trance. The flashlight in his hand swung back and forth, the beam bouncing off the trees, casting strange, shifting shadows. "Jeff, what are you doing?" Sarah called out from the back seat, her voice trembling. But Jeff just kept moving, stepping further away from the car, into the darkness. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "We have to go after him," I said, my voice shaking. I reached for the door handle, but Tyler grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "No," he said, his eyes locked on Jeff's retreating figure. "It's what it wants." "What do you mean?" I turned to look at Tyler, confusion and fear swirling inside me. Tyler's face was pale, his eyes wide. "The dream," he said, his voice barely audible. "The one I told you about. It wasn't just a dream. I think it was trying to get in, trying to take one of us." A chill ran down my spine and I felt my stomach drop. "Tyler, that's crazy," I said, but even as I said it, I could feel it. The wrongness of everything that had happened. The whispers, the shadows, the way Jeff had just walked out of the car like he was being called. Jeff was almost out of sight now, the beam of his flashlight flickering as he moved further into the woods. Without thinking, I pulled away from Tyler's grip and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The wind hit me, carrying with it that strange, whispering sound, and I shivered, my skin prickling with fear. "Jeff!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. He didn't respond, didn't even look back. He just kept walking, disappearing into the dark, the flashlight flickering and then going out completely. I ran after him, my feet slipping on the loose dirt, my heart pounding. "Jeff!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. The darkness seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like shadows, and I could feel that fear growing inside me, a cold, gnawing dread that made it hard to breathe. I stumbled over a root, falling to my knees, my hands scraping against the rough ground. I looked up, my eyes searching the darkness, but Jeff was gone. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, echoing through the trees, and I could feel it, that presence, that thing that had been watching us. It was close, so close I could almost feel its breath on my skin. "Jeff," I whispered, my voice barely audible, and then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, coming closer. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, its face obscured by the darkness. And it was coming towards me. I scrambled to my feet, my breath catching in my throat. I turned and ran, my legs burning, the cold air stinging my face. I could hear it behind me, the whispering growing louder, more insistent, like it was trying to pull me back, trying to drag me down. The SUV was just ahead, the dim glow of the interior light shining through the trees. I could see Tyler standing by the door, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Come on," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. I reached the car, my legs nearly giving out as I stumbled towards the open door. Tyler grabbed my arm, pulling me inside, and slammed the door shut behind me. The whispers stopped, cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I collapsed into the seat, my chest heaving, my whole body shaking. Tyler turned the key in the ignition again, and this time, miraculously, the engine roared to life. He didn't hesitate. He threw the car into gear and we sped down the trail, the tires skidding on the dirt, the headlights cutting through the darkness. We didn't stop until we reached the main road, the bright lights of the highway shining ahead, and even then, none of us spoke. The fear hung in the air, thick and heavy, each of us lost in our own thoughts, our own terror. We never found Jeff. We called the rangers, the police, anyone who would listen, but it was like he had vanished. The official report said he must have gotten lost in the woods, that he'd wandered too far, but I knew the truth. We all did. It wasn't just the woods. It wasn't just the wind, or the dark, or the cold. There was something out there, something that had been waiting for us, watching us, and it had taken Jeff. After that night, we all went our separate ways. Tyler and I tried to stay in touch, but the weight of what had happened, the fear that lingered, was too much. We drifted apart, the memory of that night becoming a wall between us. We never really talked about it, not in any meaningful way. We couldn't. How could we? It was like even mentioning it out loud would give it more power, would make it all real again, and we both wanted to move on, to forget as much as we could. But the truth is, I never really forgot. I don't think any of us did. There are things that stick with you, things that haunt you long after they're over, and that night was one of them. I kept replaying it in my head, seeing Jeff stepping out of the car, the way he walked towards the darkness, like something was calling him. I should have done something more. I should have stopped him. But what could I have done against something I didn't even understand? Anna and Sarah tried to reach out a few times after everything happened, but I think we all knew our friendship would never be the same. The group that used to laugh and hang out so easily was broken, and every conversation was filled with awkward pauses, like we were all afraid of where it might lead. The news barely covered it, just another missing person, one of the many who disappear every year in the wilderness, swallowed up by the vastness of nature. The police did a few searches, but nothing ever came of it. Jeff's parents were devastated, and I remember going to their house once, just after we got back. His mom opened the door, her eyes red, her face hollow, and I couldn't find the words. She asked if there was anything I knew, anything at all that might help them understand what had happened, and I just shook my head, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. I couldn't tell her the truth. How could I tell her about the whispers, about the shadow that I had seen in the woods, the one that took Jeff? It sounded insane, and maybe it was. Maybe the fear and the dark had just gotten to me, made me see things that weren't there. But it felt real. Even now, years later, it still feels real. I moved away from that town not long after. It wasn't because of what happened, at least that's what I told myself. But in reality, I just couldn't stay there, surrounded by all those memories. Every corner seemed to hold a reminder of Jeff, of that camping trip, of the laughter we'd shared before everything went wrong. I needed to get away, to start fresh somewhere that didn't hold those ghosts. I settled in a small apartment in another city, far from the forests, far from the memories. I thought maybe I could leave it all behind, that the distance would help me forget. But sometimes late at night, when the wind is blowing just right, I still hear it. That faint whisper, just at the edge of hearing, like it's calling to me from somewhere far away. A few months after I moved, I got a call from Tyler. It was strange, hearing his voice after all that time. There was a hesitation to it, like he wasn't sure he should be calling me. I remember sitting down on the couch, my heart pounding, because I just knew, he wanted to talk about that night. "Hey," he said, his voice rough like he hadn't slept in a while. I've been thinking about Jeff, about what happened. I didn't say anything, just listened, because what could I say? My chest tightened, the fear coming back, crawling up from the depths where I'd tried to bury it. "I've been having the dreams again," Tyler continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the same every time. I see the woods, the car, and I hear them, the whispers. They keep calling to me, and I think I see him sometimes. Jeff, he's just standing there, looking at me, like he's waiting for me to follow him." The words made my skin crawl, a cold shiver running down my spine. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tightly. "Tyler, it was just a dream. We were all scared, and our minds, they play tricks on us. You know that." "I thought that too," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "But last night, I swear, I heard something outside my window. The whispers, they were there, clear as day. And I don't even live near the woods. I live in the middle of the city." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him that it was all in his head, that he needed to see someone, talk to a therapist, anything. But deep down I knew what he was feeling, because I had heard them too. Not often, but enough. Enough to make me afraid, enough to make me doubt my own sanity. "I think it wants us back," Tyler whispered, his voice so soft I almost didn't hear him. "Whatever it was, it didn't finish. It's still waiting." After that call, I didn't sleep for days. I kept the lights on, every creak of the apartment building making me jump, every shadow a potential threat. I kept expecting to hear it, that whisper, that voice that had haunted us out there in the woods, but nothing came. Eventually, I forced myself to move on, to put Tyler's words out of my mind. He was just scared, like I was. It was just our imaginations. It had to be. But then, a few weeks later, I got another call. This time, it wasn't from Tyler. It was Anna. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she'd been crying. She told me that Tyler had gone missing. He'd left his apartment one night, and he never came back. No note, no sign of a struggle, just gone. His neighbors had seen him leave, said he looked like he was in a daze, like he wasn't really there. And no one had heard from him since. I hung up the phone after that call, my hands shaking, my stomach churning with fear. It was happening again. First Jeff, now Tyler. It was like whatever was out there, whatever had taken Jeff, hadn't finished. It was still reaching out, still pulling at the loose threads of our group, unraveling us one by one. I packed my things that night. I left my apartment, left the city, and I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I found a small place in the middle of nowhere, away from the woods, away from anything that might remind me of that night. I cut off contact with everyone. I didn't want anyone to know where I was, didn't want whatever it was to find me. Sometimes I wonder if it's over, if maybe I've outrun it, if maybe the whispers have finally stopped. But deep down, I don't think they have. I think it's still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting. And I think about Tyler, about Jeff, and I wonder if one day I'll hear it again, that voice, whispering my name, calling me back to the woods. There are places we're not meant to go, things we're not meant to understand. I've learned that now. Some shadows are better left alone, some whispers better left unheard, because once you hear them, once they find you, they never really let you go. They just wait, patient and silent, until the time is right. And when they call, you can't help but